Welcome to another installment of our series, Leading Ladies of the Word. In this installment, I want to cover Priscilla, who is an interesting character in the New Testament, and so let's look at the passages that mention her. First, here's a picture that I found online of Priscilla with her husband Aquila, and the other person could be either Apollos or Paul. It just depends on what the author of this artwork was going for. Acts chapter 18, verses 2 through 3, it says, there in Corinth, that would be Paul met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. So we learn a few things here. First of all, the historical fact that Emperor Claudius dismissed all the Jews, including Jewish Christians, from Rome right around the midway point in the first century. And this led this couple, Aquila and Priscilla, to Corinth as they were fleeing from that or forced to leave Rome. They ended up in Corinth. And Paul ended up in Corinth too on his second missionary journey. And so one of the things that I think Paul often did is he would seek out the synagogue in a city when he got to it. And he would also seek out fellow tradesmen, people who were also tent makers. And so he comes across this couple, Aquila and Priscilla, and he stays with them and works with them, finding out, of course, that they are Christians as well as he is, or it's possible he would have known about them beforehand, we're not sure. But he ends up staying with Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth for quite some time. It says in verse 18 and 19, Paul stayed in Corinth for some time, and then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. So we learn a couple things here also. First of all, Paul has such a good relationship with this couple that he has them come along with him on part of the missionary journey, and they must have been able co-workers with Paul, as he'll refer to later on. We also see something interesting, and that is that Priscilla is mentioned before Aquila. Now, the first time they were introduced, it said Aquila and his wife Priscilla, but now we have the wife mentioned first. It seems to be the case that when a wife or a woman is mentioned before a man in a couplet, that the woman has taken on some special significance in the story, and it could be that this is an indication that Priscilla had maybe more of a central role or a leadership role in the work that they were doing. But in any case, they arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He wants them to stay there and minister in Ephesus. Now, Ben Witherington says, this couple is always mentioned together in the New Testament, and in most of the instances, Priscilla's name comes first. By most, he means 4 out of the 6 references. Priscilla comes first. This is somewhat surprising and may well reflect her having higher social status than her husband, or greater prominence in the church, or both. So that's kind of reinforcing what we were just saying. In Acts 18:26, it says, when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, that would be Apollos. So Apollos was this guy that had come and had started teaching, and he was a really good teacher, but he didn't have the full story of the gospel. And so when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. So here we have Priscilla and her husband Aquila, but once again, Priscilla mentioned first. We have Priscilla inviting this man, Apollos, into her and her husband's home and explaining. So Priscilla is explaining or teaching the way of God more adequately. She's a better teacher than Apollos, at least in terms of content. She has much fuller content to share. He has something that he needs to learn from her. And Priscilla seems to be in the lead in this because her name is mentioned first. In Romans chapter 16, Paul is ending his great letter to the Romans and giving a bunch of greetings to different people. And he greets Priscilla and Aquila, who by this time are back in Rome. And so he says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me, not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles, and all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful for them. Greet also the church that meets at their house. So we see a number of things here. Once again, Priscilla mentioned before Aquila. Paul considers both of them his fellow workers. So they are co-workers with Paul in Christ. They both had courage to risk their lives for Paul, and the whole church, all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful for this ministry couple, and they're still hosting a house church. They greet also the church that meets at their house. So in the city of Rome, Priscilla and Aquila had a house church. And once again, I would say that it's likely that they were in a leadership role in that house church, since they were the ones hosting the church. In 1 Corinthians 16:19, we have another reference. The churches in the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, and so does the church that meets at their house. So once again, a reference to the fact that they were house church leaders. 2 Timothy also mentions this couple in 4:19, greet Priscilla and Aquila. So we have here mention of a woman in the early church that had a leading role, and she was active in the church in Rome, the church in Ephesus, and the church in Corinth. They had a role in all these different places, and probably got to be pretty well known. And that is why Luke, when he's telling the story, and Paul, when he's writing letters, makes reference to them by name, and makes reference to Priscilla, certainly by name, because she was a well-known person in the church. She was able to explain the scriptures, even to Apollos, a man, and she was host to a church gathering. And so I think that there's lots of evidence here that she had a leading role in the New Testament church in the first century. We'll continue by looking at a couple more women in this series in the next videos.